Top of page 116. Therefore, even if subtle conscious God in the man state is unconscious of the gross body and of the mental body, and does not experience directly the gross and mental worlds, still, God in the man state does make use of the gross body, though not directly, but from the subtle plane, through various aspects of the gross, and is therefore observed from all outward appearances as an ordinary gross conscious human form, which eats, drinks, sleeps, sees, feels, hears, and so forth. Similarly, God in the man state, when conscious of the second plane of the subtle world, does use his mental body, i.e. the mind, not directly, but through various aspects which give it the outward appearance of being an ordinary gross conscious human form having thoughts, desires, and emotions. At this stage, with greater involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere, and is now capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of lower degree through the release of this infinite energy, and can demonstrate such powers as converting a dry tree into a green one, and vice versa, stopping railway trains and motor cars, filling a dry well with water, and so forth. This subtle conscious God in the man state, on the second plane, experiences the subtle world with the subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally not conscious of the gross world, though from all outward appearances he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, having feelings of pain and pleasure, and so forth. Yet actually, his involved consciousness experiences not the gross, but the subtle sphere, and creates fresh subtle impressions through his subtle senses, which are 3 in number, with faculties only of seeing, smelling, and hearing. Further involution of consciousness makes it possible for God in the man state to experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here, subtle consciousness gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere, and God in the man state experiences greater finite power. In this stage, he is capable of performing grand miracles, such as giving sight to the blind, restoring limbs to the maimed, and sometimes even raising the dead into life. The note: those on the third plane of consciousness can only raise the dead of the subhuman species. In this state, subtle conscious God in the man state is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human form is capable of traveling from one continent to another using the gross vehicles at his disposal. The second and third planes of the subtle world are the 2 major planes which are solely in the domain of the subtle world. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle world and partially of the gross world. Similarly, The fourth plane is partially of the subtle world and partially of the mental world. For this reason, the fourth plane is said to be the threshold of the mental world. Now, with gradual, though progressive gain in the involution of the consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state, the consciousness of God experiences the fourth plane of the subtle cum mental. In the fourth plane, God in the man state is fully conscious of the subtle body and completely experiences the subtle sphere, and therefore he is completely aware of the subtle nature of the subtle sphere, which is infinite energy. This is the very same infinite energy which is the finite aspect in the nothingness of that infinite and unbounded power of God, which was latent in God's state of the everything. In the fourth plane, God in the man state is fully equipped with infinite energy, and thus he is now capable of raising the dead and of even creating new forms in new worlds, breathing with life. Subtle conscious God in the man state, in the fourth plane, is in reality infinite energy personified. This infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle cum mental worlds is not the ordinary so-called energy of the gross world. It is that infinite energy which is called the breath of all life, or pran, and which can cause all things to become alive. It is this energy which, when infinite, can create living things out of dust. Although this energy be infinite, it is yet by no means equivalent to the reality of that infinite power of God. This infinite power of God, which translated into illusion, becomes the finite aspect of the infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle cum mental worlds. Subtle conscious God in the man state, possessing the key to the store of the infinite energy of the fourth plane, is now firmly established on the threshold of the mental world and is confronted by the full blast of the intense desires, emotions, and thoughts, which are the aspects of mind of the mental world. Though the fourth plane is the exalted stage of consciousness where God in the man state consciously experiences himself as infinite energy personified, yet it is the state of experiences of the so-called darkest night, because here the consciousness of God in the man state undergoes the experience of being caught, as it were, between the devil and the deep. Fired by intense desires and emotions, the overpowering incitement or temptation to wield and use the infinite energy which is at his command proves a treacherous foe at this juncture, when the involution of consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state is unfailingly and rapidly progressing towards the mental sphere, where it will gain mastery over all desires, emotions, and thoughts. If desires at their zenith emanated by the mental plane, confronting the consciousness of God in the man state in the fourth plane, overpower God in the man state on the fourth plane, and if the forces generated by the infinite energy at his command are released by him, then the experience of the liberation of infinite energy at this juncture often proves fatal, especially when he grossly misuses the forces liberated by infinite energy to satisfy selfish ends indiscriminately. At this juncture, on the fourth plane, if the power of the infinite energy of the subtle world is indiscriminately liberated, the resultant effect of the complete liberation of that energy is almost unimaginable by gross consciousness. However, an idea could be gathered of that result from the fantastic experiences of the liberation of nuclear energy, which is merely one of the gross aspects of the infinite energy of the subtle world. Thus, if the involved consciousness of God in the man state succumbs to the temptation of experiencing the complete liberation of infinite energy in the fourth plane of consciousness, the inevitable experience is so severe that the full consciousness gained and the subtle consciousness experienced totally disintegrate into the most finite consciousness, identifying God once again with the most finite, gross form of stone. Consequently, the consciousness of stone-conscious God must once again go through the whole process of the evolution of consciousness, identifying himself with gross forms until he identifies with man and again wins full consciousness. It is a fact that when consciousness is once gained, it can never be lost. But the disintegration of consciousness from the fourth plane is the one exception to this rule. This disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of fourth plane consciousness, and that, too, only very, very rarely when he succumbs to the temptation of misusing the powers of that plane. If God in the man state in the fourth plane does not misuse the powers of infinite energy, but uses them discriminately without being overpowered by desires. Asterisks there. Desires must be consciously wiped out because they can create new impressions and in turn further desires which may lead to further binding actions. Consciousness is preoccupied with such impressions and their physical expression rather than with the real self. If these impressions are wiped away consciously, the soul, Atma, will then begin to perceive the truth and will begin to emancipate itself from the tyranny of worldly desires. The individual, Jiv Atma, minus life of desires, becomes soul, Atma, and is always the unconscious Almighty. It is while we are living that life must be given up. To renounce worldly desires while retaining consciousness of unconsciousness is the goal of life. That's the editor speaking there. So, back to the paragraph is, if God in the man state in the fourth plane does not misuse the powers of infinite energy, but uses them discriminately without being overpowered by desires, then with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious God in the man state experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world, skipping over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. But if God in the man state in the fourth plane neither uses nor abuses the powers of infinite energy, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state in the fourth plane of consciousness crosses the threshold of the mental world and begins to experience the fifth plane of consciousness. The fifth and sixth planes of consciousness are fundamentally the planes of the mental sphere of the mind. In the mental world, mental conscious God in the man state is master of his mind, whereas in the gross and subtle worlds, when gross and subtle conscious, he was the slave of his mind. With the progress of the involution of consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state, the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world are realized by the mental sense, which is only that of seeing. In the man state, when God is mental conscious, he is not conscious of the gross or subtle bodies, but he does work through the gross body and subtle body, not directly, but on and from the mental plane. So even if mental conscious God in the man state is not conscious of the gross and subtle bodies, and therefore does not realize the experiences of the gross and subtle worlds, he still can unconsciously utilize the gross body through various aspects of the gross. He is thus observed eating, drinking, sleeping, seeing, hearing, and feeling as in an ordinary gross conscious human form, although he is all the while conscious only of the mental body with his mental sense of only seeing. Similarly, he can unconsciously utilize his subtle body through various aspects of infinite energy, and is thus observed moving about actively and performing acts, while all the time he is only conscious of the mental body, the mind, and only consciously experiences the mental world with his mental sense. Mental conscious God in the man state, in the mental sphere, has now only one sense, and that is of seeing. The mind persists through the fifth plane of consciousness. In the sixth plane of consciousness, the mind itself becomes the inner eye and sees God. In the seventh plane of consciousness, the mind is annihilated. Hence it is that mental conscious God in the man state, in the fifth plane, experiences the impressions generated through his mental sense of seeing, and consequently experiences the mental world with the mental body, mind. He is now conscious only of mind. In this stage, God in the man state is capable of controlling the minds of gross conscious and subtle conscious states of God in subtle conscious and gross conscious human forms. But in the fifth plane, mental conscious God in the man state is totally incapable of performing any miracles, because he is now in the mental sphere and no longer in the subtle sphere of infinite energy, which, when released, resulted in miraculous powers. Yet, because he is mental conscious and about to become mind personified, he controls the minds of the subtle conscious state of God and becomes the source which incites those in the state of subtle consciousness to perform miracles. He is the one who, in the mental conscious state, according to the desire and will of his mind, is capable of checking, controlling, or guiding the minds of those in the subtle conscious planes, either to perform the miracles or not, though he himself, in his mental conscious state, cannot perform any miracle. God in the man state of mental consciousness is capable of creating and controlling the thoughts, desires, and emotions of all minds in gross and subtle conscious states. He is himself stable as soon as he experiences the state of the fifth plane, from which state the consciousness involved thus far can never devolve nor disintegrate. As the involution of consciousness of mental conscious God in the man state gradually progresses deeper and deeper, he experiences his mastery over the mind, and the consciousness of mental conscious God is said to be mind personified. Thus, God in the man state now becomes fully conscious of the mind or the mental body and experiences the whole of the mental sphere or the mental world in the sixth plane of mental consciousness. This experience is of seeing God in his original state, face to face. This seeing is the seeing of the mental consciousness with the mental sense of seeing. In other words, God in the man state sees God everywhere and in everything. Right from the first plane up through the sixth plane, the involution of consciousness progressed gradually and consistently as the consciousness of God underwent fewer and scarcer experiences of multifarious and diverse opposite impressions, which grew fainter and fainter. Therefore, during the progress of the involution of consciousness of God, the diverse opposite impressions gradually lessened and became fainter until the involved consciousness of God in the sixth plane was fully conscious of the mental body and experienced the mental world in full with practically no impressions at all except for a last faint trace of residual impressions of opposites. In other words, the involved consciousness fully identifies with the mind, and God tends to realize that he is mind. Now, God in the man state as mind has the last finite impression that he, as mind, sees God face to face in all things except in his self. This is the state of God in the man state in the sixth plane of consciousness. This mental conscious God in the man state of the sixth plane, practically void of all impressions at this point, and only conscious of mind, is now confronted by God himself and sees him face to face, and also sees him in all things. But he does not see his self in God, because he is still impressed with the consciousness of mind and takes himself as mind. This mental conscious God in the man state, associating himself with mind, is conscious of himself as mind and experiences himself as still something other than God, because he actually sees God face to face with his mental consciousness. Then, too, he sees God much more vividly and intensively than in the gross or subtle states of God he can see the gross and subtle objects in the gross and subtle worlds. In this stage, the consciousness of God, which had experienced diverse and innumerable opposite impressions, now experiences the last trace of dual impressions of opposites. Therefore, mental conscious God in the man state on the sixth plane is yet conscious of duality, that is, identifies himself as mind and differentiates himself from God. In order to understand the involution of consciousness in the mental sphere more clearly, it is necessary to understand that the mental sphere of the fifth and sixth planes of consciousness is the domain of the mind. The mind of the mental planes has two sections. In the first section, the state of mind is inquiring or reflecting. In this state, mind functions as thoughts: high thoughts, low thoughts, good thoughts, bad thoughts, material thoughts, spiritual thoughts, and thoughts of every kind, type, and state. In the second section, state of mind is impressive or sympathetic. In this state, mind functions as feelings of sufferings and emotions, feelings of desires and longings, feelings of pangs of separation, and feelings of every kind and type and state. Since mind of the mental sphere has distinct dual functions, it is inevitable that the experiences in the field of man, i.e., the mental sphere, must be distinctively of two kinds also. Thus, the mental sphere has two domains. Therefore, the domain of the fifth plane of consciousness is of thoughts, and the domain of the sixth plane of consciousness is of feelings. Consequently, the consciousness of mental conscious God in the man state in the fifth plane identifies with the first section of mind, which is inquiring or reflecting mind. Therefore, this mental conscious God in the man state of the fifth plane is the creator and master of thoughts, as he is thoughts personified, and is accordingly capable of controlling only the thought section of all minds, of all gross and subtle conscious states of God. This is often misinterpreted as controlling the minds of all gross and subtle conscious states of God. But the fact is that God in the fifth plane of consciousness does not control the mind as a whole, but controls only that state of mind which functions as thoughts. Mental conscious God in the man state, in the fifth plane of consciousness, while identifying himself as inquiring or reflecting mind, emanating only thoughts, does not identify himself with the second section of mind, and is therefore still incapable of establishing mastery over feelings, i.e., emotions and desires. With greater involution of consciousness, mental conscious God in the man state of the fifth plane progresses into the sixth plane of consciousness, wherein he gains consciousness of the second section of mind of the mental sphere, and thus tends to identify himself with that second section of mind, i.e., impressive or sympathetic mind. Mental conscious God in the man state, in the sixth plane of consciousness, experiences the mental world with the mental sense of seeing, through complete identification with feelings, and thus God in the man state is not thoughts, but is feelings personified. Wherefore, he experiences consciously the feelings of seeing God face to face continuously in all things and everywhere. He feels seeing God everywhere continuously, but he cannot feel seeing himself in God as God. For this reason, he cannot reconcile feelings of sight of God with his own identity as God, because he still identifies himself with feelings. He feels for, longs for union with God, whom he, at this stage, feels seeing face to face. This identification with the second section of mind, feelings, is the state of God in the man state, where the predominant aspect of divine love, which eventually leads to union with God, i.e., realization of the God state consciously, is manifested most forcefully. Hence, it should be clear that the fifth plane of the mental sphere is the state of full consciousness of thoughts only. The master over control and creation of thoughts alone is established. and there is no mastery or control over feelings of desires and emotions. But the sixth plane of the mental sphere is the state of full consciousness of feelings, and thus the mastery over control and creation of feelings is established, and no more scope is now left for even a single thought to penetrate into the domain of feelings. The sixth plane consciousness is thoughtless and governs the feelings of all the gross and subtle God. This is often misinterpreted as mastery over the hearts of all those in the gross and subtle conscious states of God. He does not govern or regulate the so-called hearts, but controls and governs that second section of mind in the mental sphere which emanates feelings of emotions and desires. The loving of God and the longing for his union is really and fully demonstrated in the sixth plane of consciousness. Only when the sixth plane of the mental sphere is transcended does illusion vanish with the vanishing of the last trace of impressions realized. Mental conscious God in the man state on the sixth plane is still experiencing duality, because God in this state of consciousness finds himself as mind and not as God. This experience of duality lingers on and on until the final involution of consciousness attains the seventh plane of consciousness. This is the final and seventh stage in the process of involution of consciousness, when the full consciousness of God in the man state is now fully drawn inwards, so completely that it is now fixed and focused onto himself rather than onto the objects of his own creation. Now that full consciousness has been full nothingness, which apparently appeared to exist, vanish completely, together with their impressions. With complete annihilation of impressions, of the associations of the nothing, the impressioned consciousness of God in the man state is spontaneously transformed into the unimpressioned or impressionless consciousness of God, which makes God in the man state experience the passing away in his original state of absolute vacuum. It is but natural that the full consciousness, fully involved and now free from even the slightest trace of any impression, should give no other experience but that of the original absolute vacuum state of God, which once prevailed and which is now experienced consciously. This full consciousness, fully involved, is the superconsciousness, or the Mahachait. The unconscious God in the original absolute vacuum state is now fully conscious, or superconscious, of his original state of God in the beyond state. This passing away in the absolute vacuum of the original state of God is called attaining the fauna of the seventh plane of consciousness. In Sufi terms, fauna means passing away in. Fauna has two stages. The first stage of fauna is the conscious experience of the absolute vacuum state. And the second stage of Phana, or Phanaphila, is the conscious experience of the I am God state. Phanaphila, the second stage, is the goal of God in the man state, where God, in human form, that is, as man, ultimately realizes the I am God state with full consciousness. This is the state of Phano Majzubiat, as it is termed by the Sufis. Much before first stage Phana is attained, God in man state, as man, had full consciousness of the limited ego, or I, mind, energy, body, and the world in an ordinary awake state of God in the man state, as man, was directly focused on them through the finite impressions. And as soon as the consciousness of God in the man state, as man, began to involved consciousness experienced gradually the six planes of sub-super consciousness through impressions gathered and spent in each of the six planes. When sub-consciousness completely involved, that is, was withdrawn inwards towards himself, then God in that state, as man, gained the seventh plane of superconsciousness, devoid of all impressions. This was the final stage in attaining the goal.